While Europe burned, Detroit worked.
The first Nazi prisoner collapsed to his knees when the factory gates opened, because everything he had been taught to hate, fear, and destroy was suddenly roaring alive in front of him. Steel screamed, conveyors thundered, molten light spilled from furnaces like captured suns, and beyond the iron fence, stretching farther than the eye could follow, stood a city of motion machines, birthing machines at a speed that felt obscene, almost supernatural. Detroit. They had told the prisoners this place did not exist. Oberleutnant Karl Weiss tasted blood where his teeth cut his lip. He did not realize he had been clenching his jaw until pain announced it. Around him, the other German prisoners stood frozen, striped POW uniform, hanging loose on bodies already hollowed by hunger, shame, and disbelief. An American guard barked an order. No one moved. Weiss forced himself upright and stared again. Rows upon rows of assembly lines moved with merciless precision. Engines slid forward like obedient animals. Chassis descended. Tires were bolted. Dashboards snapped into place. Human hands danced in practiced rhythm. Not frantic, not rushed confident. This was not chaos. This was mastery. Back in 1939, in a lecture hall in Munich, Weiss's instructor had slammed his fist against a map of the world and declared America is soft, lazy, divided. They cannot fight a modern war. Weiss had believed him. Now, watching a completed bomber fuselage roll forward like a verdict, Weiss felt something inside him fracture. A quiet, terrifying thought whispered in his mind. If this is real, then we are already lost. The journey north 3 days earlier, the prisoners had been loaded onto trains under heavy guard. No destination was announced. The rumor mill inside the boxcars spun wildly. Canada, a labor camp, execution. Weiss said nothing. Talking felt dangerous now. Hope was more dangerous still. The train rattled endlessly. Crossing landscapes Weiss barely registered. Fields turned to towns. Towns thickened into cities. Smoke darkened the horizon. When the doors funnily opened, cold air rushed in, sharp and metallic. Snow dusted the tracks. Above them, factory smokestacks pierced the sky like bayonets. Detroit. One guard muttered, almost casually. Detroit meant nothing to Weiss then. It would soon mean everything. Ford's River Rouge complex, the buses rolled past neighborhoods dense with brick homes and bare winter trees. Workers flooded sidewalks in waves, men and women, black and white together, something Weiss had only ever seen in propaganda caricatures. Then the road bent, and the factory appeared. The River Rouge complex was not a building. It was an empire. Rail lines fed directly into it. Ships docked beside it. Raw ore entered one end and war machines exited the other. Weiss had studied industrial theory. He knew factories. This was something else. A fellow prisoner whispered, "May God." No one corrected him. The purpose of the tour, they were herded off the buses and lined up. Guards surrounded them, but there was no panic in the Americans' posture. No fear. A civilian stepped forward, a tall man in a dark coat. Hair neatly parted, eyes sharp with calculation rather than hatred. "I'm Charles Sorensen," he said. "Executive Vice President of Ford Motor Company." The prisoners exchanged looks, a civilian addressing them. "You're here," Sorensen continued, "to see how this war is being fought." Weiss bristled. "Is this a threat?" Sorensen smiled faintly. "No. It's a demonstration." Inside the machine, they entered through doors large enough to swallow buildings. Noise hit like a physical blow. Heat followed. Weiss felt sweat break across his spine despite the cold outside. He watched workers operate presses that could flatten tanks. Watched molten steel poured with casual precision. This was not desperation. This was abundance. At one station, a young woman riveted panels onto a bomber wing. Her movements were quick, exact, almost graceful. Weiss stared. She noticed. Instead of hatred, She gave him a tired, curious look and then went back to work. That hurt more than any insult could have. Cracks in belief, a prisoner behind Weiss began shaking. They told us they were starving, the man whispered. They told us America couldn't organize anything. Weiss didn't answer. He couldn't. Every lesson drilled into him since boyhood was being dismantled bolt by bolt before his eyes. America wasn't improvising. America was prepared. The unspoken message. Sorensen walked alongside them as if escorting guests. No whips, he said softly. No chains. People work because they're paid, because they believe in what they're doing. Weiss felt anger flare. Belief doesn't build this. Sorensen stopped, turned, looked Weiss directly in the eyes. Belief builds everything. Then he gestured toward the assembly line where a completed B-24 Liberator rolled forward, gleaming under factory lights. That aircraft will be flying over Europe within weeks. Weiss imagined the sky over Germany filled with machines born here. He swallowed. Nightfall realizations. The evening, back in the camp, Weiss lay awake on his bunk. The factory's rhythm still echoed in his ears. For the first time since his capture, he didn't dream of escape. He dreamed of production schedules, of numbers too large to comprehend, of a war that had already been decided, not by generals but by assembly lines. And somewhere deep inside him, beneath indoctrination and pride, a forbidden thought took root. If Germany loses, it will be because we never understood what power truly looked like. Karl Weiss did not sleep. The barracks lights dimmed, the guards' footsteps faded, and still his mind churned with the rhythm of conveyor belts. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw engines gliding forward, steel transforming into weapons with terrifying calm. Around him, other prisoners whispered in low voices, fear creeping into conversations that once brimmed with arrogance. They said America was weak. Someone muttered. They said Jews ran everything and nothing worked. Another replied bitterly. Weiss turned onto his side and stared at the wooden slats of his bunk. The lie was no longer abstract. It had weight now. Heat, sound, and a name. Ford. The contradiction. The next morning, the prisoners were marched again toward the factory. This time they were not tourists. They were observers with intent. Charles Sorensen stood waiting, joined by another, civilian, older, thinner, with wire-rimmed glasses and a posture shaped by decades of command rather than fear. This, Sorensen announced, is Walter Rather, head of the United Auto Workers. Weiss recognized the name. German intelligence had files on American labor leaders, radicals, agitators. Rather did not look like a revolutionary. He looked tired. You're probably wondering why you're here, Rather said. Why we're showing you this. A prisoner spat on the ground. To humiliate us. Rather nodded. That too. Then he gestured toward the factory floor. But mostly to educate you. Henry Ford's shadow as they walked. Weiss noticed something strange. Portraits, not of Hitler, not of Roosevelt. Henry Ford. The industrialist's stern face appeared in offices, hallways, plaques. To Weiss, it felt uncanny. He had read Ford's writings. The International Jew. Anti-Semitic venom that had been praised in Germany. How? Weiss finally demanded, does this man serve your war? Sorensen answered without stopping. Henry Ford believed many wrong things. Rather added quietly, but he believed in production more than ideology. Weiss frowned. He admired our Führer. Rather stopped walking. So did many Americans once, he said flatly. Then we learned. The words struck harder than Weiss expected. Labor without chains. They passed a break area. Workers laughed, smoked, shared sandwiches. Black men and white men sat together at the same tables. Weiss's chest tightened. In Germany, unity was enforced. Here it seemed chosen. You allow them to stop? Weiss asked. Rather smiled thinly. We require it. A guard scoffed. If they burn out, production drops. Weiss stared. You care about them? Of course, Rather said. They're the war. That sentence lodged in Weiss's mind like shrapnel, the psychological weapon later. In a quiet office overlooking the factory floor, Sorensen spoke plainly. "This is not a prison tour," he said. "It's a message." Weiss met his gaze. "To whom?" "To Berlin." Silence followed. "You'll write home," Sorensen continued. "You'll talk when you're repatriated. You'll remember what you saw." Reuther leaned forward. "We're not trying to break your bodies, we're breaking your illusions." Weiss felt anger surge. "You think machines win wars?" Sorensen nodded once. "Every modern one." A letter never sent that night. Weiss requested paper. He wrote slowly, carefully, "Mother, they lied to us. America is not chaos. It is order. It is relentless." His hand trembled. "If they choose to fight fully, we cannot match them." He folded the letter, stared at it. Then he tore it into pieces and flushed it away. Some truths were too dangerous to release. Whispers of work days passed. Then a rumor spread. They're assigning U.S. labor. Fear rippled through the barracks. Forced labor was expected. Abuse. Starvation. Instead, they were given a choice. Work details inside non-sensitive areas of the complex: cleaning, maintenance, transport, or remain idle in camp. Idle men decayed faster. Weiss volunteered. Inside as a worker, his first assignment was mundane. Sweeping metal shavings near an engine line. He worked under watch, but not under threat. An American foreman approached. "You done this before?" Weiss hesitated. "Engineering. University." The foreman grunted. "Figures. Don't sweep near the rollers, you'll lose a hand." That was it. No insult, no cruelty. Just practical concern. Weiss swallowed. The woman with the rivet gun, he saw her again, the woman from before. Her name, he learned, was Margaret Maggie Collins. She worked 12-hour shifts and still smiled when the foreman cracked jokes. When she noticed Weiss staring, she raised an eyebrow. "Never seen a woman work before?" she asked. Weiss flushed. "Not like this," she smirked. "War changes things." "Yes," Weiss said quietly, "it does." A crumbling wall at lunch. Maggie sat across from him. "Why'd you fight for them?" she asked, not unkindly. Weiss hesitated. "Because they taught us it was right." She nodded. "They taught us some wrong things too. Difference is we're allowed to argue." That sentence echoed louder than the factory. Allowed. The numbers one afternoon. Weiss was shown a production board. Daily outputs, weekly targets, projected increases. His stomach dropped. "This is impossible," he whispered. A supervisor shrugged. "Yesterday's impossible is today's quota." Weiss calculated quickly. Bombers per month. Engines per year. Germany cannot survive this, he thought. The quiet collapsed that night. Weiss finally slept, and dreamed not of victory or defeat, but of choices. Of a world where belief was not enforced at gunpoint. Of a future that terrified him more than death. Because it meant everything he had sacrificed for was wrong. Detroit did not look like the enemy Carl Weiss had been trained to imagine. From the fence transport truck, he watched the city pass in fragments. Brick apartment buildings with laundry hanging like flags of ordinary life, diners glowing warm against the winter gray, streetcars rattling through intersections where people hurried not in fear but purpose. No one screamed at the sight of them. No one threw stones. Some people stared, some turned away. A few children waved before being tugged back by anxious parents. Weiss felt unmoored. Hatred, he had learned, was supposed to be loud. Public knowledge. The newspapers broke the story 2 weeks later. Nazi POWs tour Ford plant war production, shown to German captives. The headline ignited Detroit. At first, anger surged. "They don't deserve to see that." A machinist snapped in a break room. "My brother died in Africa," another said. "Why are we educating Nazis?" But something else followed the outrage. Curiosity. Why show them? What was the point? And slowly, a realization spread, quiet, unsettling. Because we can. The guard who didn't hate Sergeant Earl Thompson had fought in North Africa. He had seen men burned inside tanks. He had lost friends whose names he could no longer say without tasting metal. And yet, standing watch over Weiss, Thompson felt no urge to strike him. "You know," Thompson said one evening as snow fell softly over the camp, "I thought I'd feel something different." Weiss looked up. "Different?" "Anger," Thompson said. "But mostly I feel tired." Weiss nodded. "So do I." They stood in silence, two men emptied by causes larger than themselves. A city at work as labor shortages worsened, Detroit transformed. Women filled factory floors. Elderly men returned to work. Teenagers lied about their age. Churches organized scrap drives. Housewives rationed sugar with military precision. Weiss watched it all. This wasn't forced unity. It was voluntary sacrifice. The difference gnawed at him. The factory floor revisited. Weiss's responsibilities expanded. He was trusted with inventory counts. Nothing sensitive, but enough to see the system breathe. Raw steel entered on rail cars. Finished engines left on trucks. No bottlenecks, no chaos. When a machine broke, 3 men appeared instantly. When a worker faltered, someone replaced them without drama. It was not heroic. It was relentless. A conversation with Maggie during a late break. Maggie leaned against a railing, wiping grease from her hands. "You ever miss home?" she asked. Weiss hesitated. "I miss who I thought I was." She studied him. "That sounds heavy." "It is." She shrugged. "War's good at that." Then, softer, "You're not what I expected." He laughed once, bitter. "Neither is your country." The lesson no one announced one afternoon. The POWs were allowed to sit in the factory auditorium. A film played. It showed the assembly line in motion, synchronized with marching soldiers overseas. Engines turning into wings, wings turning into air superiority. No narration, just images. Weiss realized the brilliance of it. No boasting, no threats, just evidence. Letters home, some prisoners began writing again. The censorship officers noticed a change. No defiance, no ideology, just confusion. One letter read, "They are not starving. They are building." Another, "If this continues, the war cannot end any other way." Berlin did not reply. The pastor's visit, a local pastor, requested permission to visit the camp. The guards expected tension. Instead, the pastor brought coffee. "You don't have to pray with me," he said, "but you're welcome to listen." Weiss sat at the back. The pastor spoke not of victory but responsibility. "Every man," he said, "must live with what he supports." That night, Weiss dreamed of standing before a machine that stamped choices instead of steel. The riot that never was. Rumors spread of an attack. Angry civilians. Revenge. The camp prepared. It never came. Instead, a group of Detroit workers gathered outside the fence with food. Not for the prisoners, for the guards working double shifts. Weiss watched from a distance, stunned. Even resentment here was disciplined. A dangerous thought. Weiss began to wonder what would happen after the war. If Germany lost, what then? Could a nation unlearn lies? Could a man? The thought scared him more than death, because it required living. The unasked question one night, Maggie found Weiss staring at a bomber wing. "You ever think about what happens when this ends?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "Constantly." She nodded. "Me too." They stood side by side watching the machine hum. Neither spoke of forgiveness, neither spoke of guilt, but both felt the weight of a future neither had planned. The city. Watches back. Detroit noticed the prisoners changing. Less defiant. More silent. Someone joked, "We're winning the war with overtime and manners." But beneath the humor lay something deeper. They weren't just building weapons. They were building doubt inside the enemy. The breaking point approaches. Weiss felt it coming. A moment where belief would shatter completely. He didn't know when or how. Only that the machines would not stop, and neither would the truth. The moment Carl Weiss realized this was no longer about production, but about conversion, came quietly, without speeches, without guards, without warning. It came with a clipboard. He was standing near the engine assembly line when an American supervisor handed him a form. Inventory verification, nothing remarkable. Weiss scanned the numbers automatically. Then he froze. The figures weren't impressive. They were impossible. Weiss recalculated in his head. Daily output, weekly scaling, shipping cadence. His breath caught. If these numbers were accurate, and he knew they were then, the war was already over. Not militarily. Psychologically, because no nation could fight an enemy that replaced losses faster than they could be inflicted, and America wasn't even strained yet. The midpoint realization, Weiss leaned against a steel column, the vibration of the factory humming through his bones. This is the battlefield, he thought. And we never sent troops here. A bomber engine slid past him, gleaming indifferent. No one shouted, no one celebrated. That was the most terrifying part. The unspoken strategy later that day, Weiss was summoned not by guards, but by Sorensen himself. The office overlooked the factory floor. Sunlight filtered through high windows, illuminating rows of motion below. Sorensen didn't sit. "Do you know why we're showing you everything?" he asked. Weiss didn't answer immediately. Then, carefully, "So we understand we cannot win." Sorensen nodded. "That's part of it. And the rest?" Sorensen finally sat. "So when this war ends, men like you know what rebuilding actually requires?" Weiss frowned. "You expect us to help?" "No," Sorensen said calmly. "We expect you to remember." A dangerous kind of mercy. The guards began relaxing procedures, not carelessly but deliberately. Tools were counted, areas remained restricted. But the tension eased. Trust was being demonstrated. Some prisoners couldn't bear it. One man, Otto Brandner, snapped. "They're corrupting us," he hissed one night, "making us forget who we are." Weiss replied quietly, "Or reminding us." Brand lunged. Guards intervened before blows landed. Brander was isolated, removed. The message was clear. You were free to think, but not to poison others. Detroit speaks outside the factory. Detroit changed too. Billboards urged longer shifts. Radio broadcasts praised factory workers as soldiers without rifles. Weiss listened from the camp. No one spoke of extermination. No one spoke of destiny. They spoke of doing the job. The contrast felt unbearable. Maggie's brother Maggie found Weiss during a late shift. "My brother died over Sicily," she said suddenly. Weiss stiffened. She held up a hand. "I'm not blaming you," she swallowed. "I just want you to know why I work like this." Weiss nodded, unable to speak. She continued softer. "If building this ends it faster, then I can live with the noise." Weiss watched her return to the line, rivet gun snapping like punctuation. He had no answer. The moment, subscribe integration that night, as Weiss lay awake, listened to the distant pulse of the factory still running after midnight. Strange thought surfaced. If you're holding onto this moment with me, watch a war turn without a single shot being fired, don't look away now. Stay with it. There's more just ahead. Then reality rushed back in. The machines never slept. Neither did the truth. The test weeks later, a test arrived. A small fire broke out near a non-critical assembly section. Nothing dangerous. Contained quickly. But for a brief moment, panic. Weiss reacted without thinking. He grabbed an extinguisher. Shouted instructions. Directed workers away from risk. An American foreman stared at him afterward. "You didn't have to do that." Weiss replied, breathless, "Someone did." The foreman nodded slowly. Trust shifted again quietly. The report to Washington, a classified memo, left Detroit. Exposure of POWs to full industrial capacity appears to be yielding measurable psychological impact. Defiance decreasing, compliance increasing. Ideological rigidity weakening. No one called it propaganda, they called it evidence. The breaking of Otto Brandner attempted escape. He didn't get far. When he was brought back, beaten not by guards but by failure, he screamed at Weiss. They're turning you into one of them. Weiss replied softly, no. They're turning me into myself. Brandner wept the unavoidable conclusion one evening. Weiss stood alone on the factory floor after shift change. The silence was overwhelming. For the first time, he imagined Germany after defeat. Ruins. Hunger. Then he imagined this place: tools, order, rebuilding. The difference was not race. It was organization and belief in the future. The war did not end in Detroit with a celebration. It ended with a slowdown. Carl Weiss noticed it first in the silence. Not complete silence, nothing in a factory this vast ever truly stopped, but a thinning of sound, fewer shifts, longer pauses between the thunder of presses, engines completed and rolled away without replacements immediately taking their place. The machine that had seemed eternal was finally easing its grip. Weiss stood near the edge of the assembly floor, hands clasped behind his back, watching a line go idle. The workers didn't cheer, they didn't clap. They simply removed their gloves, wiped their hands, and waited for instruction. That, more than anything else, told him how this war had been won, not with frenzy, with control. The new Germany surrendered in May. The announcement crackled through the camp radio, distorted but unmistakable. For a long moment, no one spoke. Some prisoners collapsed onto their bunks. Others stared at the ground. One man laughed once, then covered his face. Weiss felt nothing at first, just emptiness, as if a structure inside him, something that had held his life together since boyhood, had finally been dismantled cleanly, efficiently, without ceremony, just like the machines. Detroit reacts in the city. There were parades, but they were quieter than Weiss expected. People hugged. Churches rang bells. Factories shut down lines one by one. Workers went home early and sat on their porches, unsure what to do with the sudden space where urgency had lived for years. Maggie found Weiss near the fence that evening. "It's over," she said. "Yes," he replied. She hesitated. "I don't know how to feel." Weiss nodded. "Neither do I." The final visit, Charles Sorensen returned one last time. He walked the factory floor slowly, as if memorizing it. When he reached Weiss, he stopped. "You saw what we wanted you to see," Sorensen said. "Yes." "Do you understand why?" Weiss looked out across the vast, quiet space. "Because you wanted us to know that this world doesn't belong to myths. It belongs to systems, to people who plan for tomorrow." Sorensen allowed himself a small smile. "Good." Then he extended his hand. Weiss took it. No one took a photograph. Repatriation, the POWs were processed in groups. Medical checks, paperwork, clean clothes, no speeches. As Weiss boarded the train that would take him east toward a Europe he barely recognized anymore, he looked back one last time. The factory stood silent now, massive and patient, as if it could wake again at any moment if history demanded it. Maggie stood near the platform. She raised a hand. Weiss returned the gesture. That was all. Germany, after the ruins, were worse than Weiss had imagined. Cities broken open like exposed machinery. People hollowed by hunger and grief. Children who stared with eyes far too old. Weiss walked through it all carrying an invisible weight, the memory of Detroit. He did not speak of it at first. Who would believe him? The trial years later, Weiss stood before a denazification board. They asked him where his loyalty had gone. He answered honestly. "I learned what power really is," he said, "and it does not come from fear." They studied him for a long time. Then they let him go. Rebuilding, Weiss became an engineer again, not for weapons, for factories. He helped rebuild workshops, train workers, organize flows of material. He refused slogans. Refused flags on walls, only schedules, processes, accountability. When asked where he learned this, he gave the same answer every time. Detroit. A letter, finally sent in 1952. Weiss wrote a letter to Maggie. He did not know if she still worked at Ford. He did not know if she would remember him. But he wrote anyway. "You once asked me what happens when this ends. I think I know now. What remains is what we choose to build next. Months later, a reply arrived. I remember, and I'm glad you're building something better. The legacy no one taught history books would later mention the factories, the bombers, the numbers, but they would not mention the prisoners who walked those floors and felt their worldviews collapse under the weight of evidence. They would not mention the quiet war fought without gunfire, but it happened, and it worked. Final image years later. An old man stood outside a small factory in a rebuilt German town. Inside, machines hummed smaller, quieter, but precise. A young worker asked him, "Why do we do it this way?" The old man smiled faintly. "Because I once saw what happens when people believe in the future more than they believe in lies.